Hi, welcome everyone to our first and hopefully what will be a series of community conversations with our community, hosted here by Raksha today. Today, to kick this off, we are at the tail end of Black History Month, but it's just the beginning of many more conversations of important topics for our community. To kick us right off today, I will be talking to three amazing women from our community. Karima Dillard, who is currently, she is the Director of Policy and Community Engagement at the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Karima also worked at Raksha in community partnerships and development. And in addition to all her domestic violence work, she has been a local activist and an organizer, advocating for housing and racial justice in Atlanta for a long time. So welcome, Karima. Also, Rupkata. Rupkata is a dear youth in our community at Georgia State. She has been advocating and lending her voice for all communities, for allyship, for Black lives. She has dedicated a lot of time to social justice for BIPOC communities, and we are so excited to have her to bring the youth view into focus here. And then thirdly, Moushami. Moushami, Atlanta born and raised, parents from Kolkata. She is married to Lanero, her African-American husband, for almost 12 years now, with a 9-year-old adorable son, Landon. And Moushami will be here to talk with us also on her experiences in the South Asian community. So we're going to kick it right off with Karima. So Karima, so glad to have you here. Look, yeah. So like I mentioned in your intro, you have worked with Raksha, which focuses on, the South Asian community, bringing your expertise to that area, right? To this. Tell us a little bit about your work with the South Asian community and domestic violence, you as an ally, and how this allyship is important in helping the victims across families affected by domestic violence.
Yeah, I'm so glad that we're having this conversation. It's such an exciting topic, and one that I didn't even know I was interested in. When I was a student at Georgia State, I was interning with Raksha, and then eventually came on staff. And one of my colleagues actually asked me, as a Black woman, my colleague was Asian. And as a Black woman, why are you working with South Asians? And I thought about it and I was like, that's a really good question. And then this quote that is just very near and dear to my heart, Aboriginal activist Lila Watson said once, if you have come to help me, you're really wasting your time. But if your liberation is bound up with mine, then we can work together. Wow. And in so many ways, I see my liberation as a Black queer woman in Atlanta bound up with South Asian survivors, immigrants, absolutely bound together. And I felt an even more determination to bring my expertise and lend my voice to the struggle for immigrant rights and survivor rights, because when one of us wins, we all win. When the most marginalized of us is served and supported and healed and can thrive, then we all can.
Yeah, and that's deep, and that's you know what, it's actually the essence of
Mhm.
why we're talking, right? Because we have to understand, we have to know that we're in this together, right? We're interwoven, and how do you? I mean, and obviously we agree, we see that, but in your work, what kind of challenges do you see for, you understand this, but I'm sure you've had experiences where it's probably made your work harder because people you were working with didn't agree or were not. Do you have any of those experiences you could talk about, or maybe how to get around it, how we can continue this, the good work?
Yeah, the good work and getting in good trouble, right?
Right.
Um, yeah, so a funny story. A colleague of mine who is Muslim and blind, she and I had been working together on a project. She worked for another organization when I was with Raksha, and now we work together. And we saw each other socially at a theater production of some sort. And she was with a friend, I was with a friend. We saw each other. Oh, hi, how you doing? Hug, hug, hug. Pre-COVID times, right?
Right.
And and then we chit chatted a bit, and then we both went to our seats. And the friend that she was with said, "Huh? How do you know her? How do you know Karima?"
Mhm.
And she said, "Oh, she's South Asian. She works for Raksha. She's really great, et cetera, et cetera." And her friend, who was a Black woman, said, "She's Black." My colleague was like, "No, no, she's got a Muslim name. Like, no, no, she works with the South Asian community. Like, no, she's not." And her friend was like, "I am pretty sure she is a Black woman." Um, so that said, I think one of the biggest challenges that I have had, and this isn't unique to me by any means,
Yeah.
but it's global anti-Blackness. It is so real, it's so deep, and it's so institutionalized that it really does make progress challenging. Now, that is not to say that the people that I worked with at I didn't encounter um, any overtures, any anti-Blackness overtures. People were just wonderful to me. Um, but when we start talking about housing, affordable housing, for example, in the city of Atlanta or even in the metro area, and the places that are affordable are usually in low income, high poverty areas where you've got concentrated poverty, you've got a lot of Black people, and trying to explain that this is bigger than just interpersonal dynamics or
Right.
interracial dynamics. This is a global issue. We have been trained and incentivized to hate one another.
Yes.
Um, that was hard. That was hard, and I can't say that I ever accomplished anything bigger than, hey, let's talk about it, let's strategize, let's problem solve, so we can get
Right.
you half. You know, yeah, that was a big barrier, and global anti-Blackness is just so real and it's so insidious, and it just makes coming together hard. I'll say this one thing and then we can move on. I don't want to take up too much time or
No,
space.
no, go ahead.
I recall being a student, an undergrad student up in New York, and fresh off my little Atlanta boat. I was also born and raised here in Atlanta, and I went to school in Poughkeepsie, and my professor was teaching. She was a sociology professor, really badass sociology professor, and she asked the question, knowing I was from Atlanta. She smiled at me and she said, "Karima, who started the civil rights movement?" And very proudly, I said, "Martin Luther King Jr." I mean, come on. And she smiled at me, and I felt like I was in the ocean and a shark had opened their mouth, and I noticed that I was right in their clutches, and there was nowhere for me to go. And it was this blossoming time for me as a budding organizer trying to figure out what this was all about, you know? And
Yeah.
one of the things that I discovered was that there was a really, really big fear, and still is, amongst people who have power, people who manipulate power, people who wield power, that if we all come together, you know, influencers, thinkers, strategists, organizers from all different walks of life, if we all come together around a common interest, they better watch the hell out. And that's
Exactly.
when we started losing people
Hmm.
strategically. Assassinations were happening because there was a fear that if we all come together, we're about to revolutionize this country. And that started me on this path to try to figure out how can we all come together to make real sustainable change.
Yeah, that's the big question, right? And you hit on something that's really in our communities, you know, we've been groomed to focus on the anti-Blackness that is inherent in our South Asian and Asian culture. I mean, that's not even something we're going to debate. We know it's there. We know that within our culture, just among Indians or Pakistanis or Bengalis, is lighter skin means more beautiful, right? Darker skin means, and that transfers across the oceans to the U.S. and to every other culture that we interact with. And what I think that are, you know, people don't realize, South Asians, I don't know, do you not see that we've been called the model minority, which, come on, we're not, right? There is no such thing. It's a title you give. It's all meant at pitting us against each other. I'm going to make you think you're better than somebody else so that you are on my side, right? It's that fear of us coming together. And then, you know, we hone in on these things. And it's used in, it shows up, right, when we talk about other issues, like immigration, or, you know, talking about at school admittance and things like that, right? And that's what we fight. That's what we fight. And that's the conversations that we have day in and day out, trying to say, this is who we are, and these are the things we need to overcome. We need to get over this. And so I'm going to pitch to Rupkatha. I know as you have done some programs and a lot of work in trying to educate and bring these issues to light in your community. Talk to us a little bit about the setbacks you've faced, you know, how you've tried to raise these issues, some of the setbacks you've faced, and what do you think are the next steps? How can we get to a point where we can talk about these things with people who don't agree with?
Yeah. So firstly, thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this conversation. But something that we're learning as youth is that, and this is universal, the first unit at which you can radicalize people is in your family structure, right? So we work primarily with, especially because the pandemic has fundamentally changed the ways in which we organize, and the ways in which we're able to exercise our activism. It's a lot more about education and sharing resources now, especially because people have more access to it through social media than it's been ever before. But some of the larger problems we face is kind of, and Grandma was touching on this earlier, there's a spectrum of global anti-Blackness. So when we talk about deconstructing anti-Blackness in the Asian community, we kind of face anti-Blackness in our own cultural hierarchies, as we see with like casteism. But there's a difference between like an ingrained anti-Blackness in terms of like skin color or fairness versus criminalizing Black people. So there's it's one thing to talk to your family members about how melanated skin doesn't necessarily translate to a negative stereotype, and it's another thing to deconstruct this idea that we criminalize things like poverty and homelessness that primarily afflict Black communities. So when we tried to start conversations about Black Lives Matter in our Bengali community earlier this year, something that we largely faced was this negative characterization of the Black Lives Matter movement as like looters and thieves and thugs. And that's not because, obviously, there were political undertones of the Black Lives Matter movement being painted as this, I have like a number of bad things, like a socialist movement or something like that, was totally fundamentally unrelated to the fact that it was a human rights movement. But we saw that the critiques of the Black Lives Matter movement fundamentally could be drawn back to roots in criminalizing Black people. So because, and kind of going back to this idea of the model minority myth, because there are positive stereotypes that surround South Asian and Asian communities in the United States. So a lot of us belong to upper middle class or middle class backgrounds, and our population, our demographic kind of over indexes maybe like a more affluent sector of like our wealth or income background. So we often criminalize Black people because they are more afflicted by poverty, and we cannot fundamentally relate to them because we don't even belong to the same socioeconomic background, partly because of this model minority myth. There are positive stereotypes that surround our community. We have more access to education. So discussing these things with our parents and kind of disconnecting our socioeconomic background from the model minority myth, the fact that we don't necessarily deserve these opportunities more than anybody else, it's just being used as like a wedge in between our communities to continue this perpetuation and of criminalizing Black people and depriving them of opportunities. So those are some of the barriers that we definitely ran into.
Yeah. And, you know, one thing that I have also seen in my work as you talk about, you know, South Asians perpetuating this false model minority is we're not all affluent. We are not all highly educated people. Mm-hmm. We are, in essence, when we, as South Asians, ignore these social issues, ignore the deprivation of human rights for certain classes, we ignore major things like, hey, it's your own people. It's your own people. And then secondly, we would not be where we are without the civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. We wouldn't even be here. And that's usually where I start my conversation. You know, a lot of the other thing in immigration, right? You've seen South Asians like to talk about, oh, well, I came here the right way, or whatever. When you talk about, you know, problems that are brought up, and it's like, you had a different opportunity. You were in a position that gave you that opportunity. And you wouldn't have ever had that opportunity were it not for people who died in a movement, right? And in some ways, and like for us, we know, okay, we owe that. We feel that, and like Karima was saying, right? We were in this together. You know, no one wins unless we all win. It's for all of us. But, you know, Rupkata, one thing too is thinking about, we hear a lot of talk about, you know, our next generation. It's generational, right? Mm-hmm. Do you really see that? Do you really see among your peers that hope that this next generation is going to do something magical that we have not been able to do in decades in the United States?
So I think we're at like a critical, like revolutionary point in history, simply because of like everything that we've seen over this past year that maybe the generations before us hadn't seen before. And like growing, like,
haven't wanted to see.
Oh yeah, exactly. They haven't been afflicted by what we've seen in the past 2 decades. Mm-hmm. When I was very, very young at the time, but there was a spike in anti-Asian hate crimes because of 9/11. And it's again happening here because of the political rhetoric surrounding us. So we're kind of stepping into this time where the stress on intercollective generation, and the fact that our struggles are tied to the struggles of the marginalized people below us, and if we're able to improve their well-being and their status, and everybody's lives and well-beings are ultimately improved, we're seeing that like that's stressed as an important point even more, because like I touched on a second ago, anti-Asian hate crimes have exponentially grown in the past year, and we're seeing that all of these things are rooted in white supremacy ultimately. So the conversation, instead of about oppression, it shouldn't be about oppression Olympics and I am being discriminated against now, why is this not being as focused as Black Lives Matter was over the summer? It's about how it can all be rooted back to the same cause, and if we have conversation about white supremacy, then we can ultimately deconstruct all of these things and achieve collective liberation.
Yeah. You know, and definitely. And I am holding out my hope and working. And that's why I continue to work with you and other youth like you, because we need it. We need everyone in this fight, educating and motivating and working together. So Mashmi, you in your life experience, you know, we're talking, you know, from Prima talk from a Black woman's perspective, Rupkatha from a, you know, South Asian female perspective. Tell us a little bit about your experience. It's that next step. I see it, right? In the acceptance of different races. And then we know how our culture is when it comes to marriage
and
yes,
relationship.
Right?
Well, I want to first thank you all for having me on this panel today to discuss this. I will say that as a South Asian, you know, many of my friends are African American, but growing up, it was always, you have to marry Indian. You have to marry Indian, you know, specifically Bengali and Hindu, but you better be Indian, you know? And of course, I went the complete opposite way. Whereas, you know, I was only 21. I was technically like still a baby is how I felt. But I just happened to fall in love with somebody who is African American. And yeah, I literally just happened to fall in love with him, and then had to hide it for several years from my parents. But the most, like one of the biggest things was, you know, we have our religious ceremonies called pujas. So
yeah,
I would like for him to come to these places, and I would buy him Indian clothes, and like, look, you have to come, because he was so interested in my culture and my background, who I was. Of course, it was never like he was anti-Indian or anything. You know, he wanted to learn everything that he could. So I would bring him around to events, and people would see him, and I could see people were whispering, people were saying things, and of course, word would get back to my parents. But I will say that, you know, in this first 7 years of us being together, my brother and my late Aunt Pew did an enormous job of, you know, just supporting and advocating for both of us to be together. They would continuously call my mom and speak to her and tell her. My mom was kind of like stuck between a rock and a hard place with my dad. But as soon as we got engaged, it was like everything just fell off, you know, and my parents, my dad, pretty much, that was it. He just like fell in love with him immediately. It was crazy. So then we had the whole battle of, okay, now we're planning a fusion Blindian wedding in India, you know.
Blindian, I like that.
Exactly. So that was a whole nother situation, you know, but it was amazing just going to India and bringing my American friends over there and showing them so much stuff, you know, and then like bringing my fiance there at the time. We've been married for almost 12 years now, and he's been to India several times since. And it's just, I'm hoping that I know I'm not like in a professional organization that is advocating for, you know, anti-Blackness awareness in South Asian communities, but I'm just looking at it as, I hope that little bit that I can do and have done can show other, you know, Indian people, like my parents' generation, my generation, even our kids' generation, like, hey, you can fall in love and be with somebody who is Black and be happy, you know. But unfortunately, South Asians have this whole negative stigma about Black people. And it's not just, you know, and it goes deeper than that. It does go back to the whole light skin, dark skin thing, you know. And I would give a prime example. Of course, I was a child when Mississippi Masala came out, but I watched it as a teenager, and I was like, oh my goodness, this, like, where has this movie been all my life? You know, and they hit every point in that movie.
They hit it from you.
Yeah, they hit every.
Deliberately.
And even with the whole in the wedding scene in the very beginning when they were at the Indian wedding, and the main character Shrita Chaudhary, you know, she's Bengali and she's like my complexion, and somebody made a comment about her saying, "Oh, who's gonna marry her? She's a darkie," you know, and I've been called that all my life when we would visit
Yeah.
India, a darkie. So it was just like it goes further than just anti-Blackness. We have our own issues in our own communities with light skin and dark skin to deal with, you know? So we've got to push past that barrier first.
Yeah.
I don't know how, but I'm hoping
Right.
that it happens.
Yeah. And I am so happy for you that you're happy and that, because at the end of the day, that's what it's all about, right? And that your story, you know, has a happy ending. But it's,
Thank you.
you know, it's something though that it's a reflection of our greater culture. And like in most cultures, just like Hollywood, you know, we've got Bollywood and we've got all those, you know, ideas and stereotypes. You know, if a major actress marries a white, you know, pop star in the US, that's woohoo, that's great. But a South Indian actress marries a British Black actor, and that's horrible, right?
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
we see those things perpetuated. It's all the, you know, what will people say
Right.
Type of thing. So I want to kind of like open it up right now. If you have any other comments, I was going to kind of look to some questions. Those of you that are watching on any of the live streams right now, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, please, you know, drop questions. Drop questions in here. Let us know if you have questions for any of our panelists.
I'd like to make a comment if I could. I think Moshami's last comment was really quite salient and really speaks to, again, what a united front could look like. So when we look at a situation like colorism, that exists in every culture that I can imagine. Well, not every culture, obviously. Indigenous and Aboriginal cultures probably don't experience it to the degree that we do. But if we look at that, the roots of that are in white supremacy and anti-Blackness. And if we all came together in a united front around colorism, for example, something that we all experience, something we can all speak to, I think that might be a place to start. There are so many entry points into this work in building community and coming together. I think the question often is asked, you know, what do I do? How do I support? There is some edification that can happen for sure. But I don't want it to stop at just, you know, learning something, reading a book, having a conversation. We've got to be about the business of donating our talent and our time and our tithes to social change and social justice organizations that are really trying to do the work of dismantling white supremacy. We have to name it that. We have to call it out when we see it. And we have to do it all the time. You know, I think this summer this summer was really intense and incredible for so many reasons. It was, and there seemed to be this kind of energy around, yes, let's create a commercial that talks about how great or how much we appreciate the struggle of Black people, or let's have a billboard out that talks about how much we support Black Lives Matter. And then here we are in February, and we don't hear as much of that anymore. Even during Black History Month, we're hearing a little bit. Right. We were hearing it before. So we have to keep going, you know, not just posting something on Facebook, not just having a conversation with your family, but really showing up. When I think about we lost a comrade in the activist community in Atlanta, Brother Haroon, who was just magnificent. And when I think about intersectionality, and I think about how Brother Haroon would show up to every struggle, he could see how him showing up to this protest was going to help his people in the streets, back in Southwest Atlanta. Like, he could see that. And people in the South Asian community showed up for him. And it was this mutual aid that was incredible and important. And I wanted to name him. I wanted to bring him in the space.
Thank you for doing that.
Yeah.
And I want to say one more thing. I think something that we also struggle with as South Asian activists is not acting as a proxy for Black voices and making sure we're continuing to hold space for Black people to speak about their struggles, so we're not talking over them, and or we're not portraying their struggles through a lens that we see it in. For us, it's a lot about, yes, being the ones in our community to start these conversations, but also ensuring that we hand the mic over to Black people, give them the platform that they need to talk about their struggles instead of us. Dilute.
And that's right. You're right, Rupata, because that's what allyship is, right? Allyship is we don't self-identify, but we stand next to, we stand behind, never in front. We stand next to, we stand behind, and we provide support, we provide friendship, and we advocate. Those are, that's the high level. But, and maybe Karima, you can give us more info on the question that has come up is like, what would be the request for the community, for the South Asian community?
I honestly think Rupkata said it really well. Okay. Show up with your resources, use your platform to give the mic to folks who are experiencing or who are the most impacted by laws and practices that keep us oppressed. Use your platform, use your influence, use your resources. That's what I would say in the interim.
I was going to say something, Vianti, you've mentioned something about how is the next generation going to be different when for decades and decades it's been the exact same. I agree with that because there are still like pockets of communities in every city, in every state in America. I mean, all over the world, but we're going to focus on the US right now, where there are only just South Asian families and communities and suburbs that live together, and they only kind of like distill focus on each other, and their minds don't open up to become friends with Black people, African Americans or Hispanic community or anything like that, right? So their children are also learning that same mindset, so my thing is like, how do we open up their minds? Our parents' generation is one thing, right? I don't even know how we can get through to like 70, 80-year-olds at this point, okay? But there's people in our age range in 30s and 40s and 50s who we should be able to break through to them because they have children who are the next generation. So that is the biggest thing. It's like, how do we know that they're going to change drastically when they're pretty much still living in that same bubble of not expanding their minds and not communicating with African American people, and they just stay with their own type, if that's okay to say. I mean, it's just, you just have that. And
that lack of experience. I mean, and we also know that our education system isn't going to help that.
No, because education it's focused on one thing. So
it is. And living in a state, we're really here. And one thing you see in Georgia is that if we want this done, if we're going to dismantle white supremacy by coming together, by Black and brown communities coming together, and it's the only way we're going to do it.
Right.
Because like Karima said earlier, white supremacy is perpetuated on one of the things that keeps white supremacy there is keeping us against each other and apart.
Exactly. Yeah.
That is key. And like you said last summer, what made it such a movement and what was powerful were that we all came together. And I think part of what we sort of saw was what can happen when we all come together.
Right.
One thing yesterday I heard down, we were having the protests down at the Capitol. But something that came out of that too, as you think about it, is you hear, and every life lost is horrible. Every life lost is a life lost. None is worth, I don't think one that's more popular is worth more than the ones you don't hear about. But we need to have the loud voices and the loud movement for our local, hometown,
Right.
brothers and sisters that we lose on the streets, the violence.
Right.
We need to be just as vocal. We need to care just as much.
And it's sad that it happens when somebody is murdered, is when we all come together. It shouldn't take that. It happens, right? But we should move forward that way in general. Like, it shouldn't be like, oh gosh, this person got killed again by another cop. Like, that shouldn't be the only thing. Like, we should already be trying to be allies together and hope that doesn't happen.
And also looking at violence even more broadly, like the violence that is poverty, the violence that is housing that you can't afford, the violence that is Black people experiencing COVID at disparate rates than other groups. Like, all of that is violent, and speaking out and being incensed about that as well, because we're out here dying, not just from cops, but from diabetes and poverty. And it, of course, it's not to say that all Black people are anything. We are clearly not a monolith. And I want to make that really clear. All Black people are not poor. All Black people are not sick. All Black people are not being killed by AIDS. I just need to say that emphatically. But being as incensed about all of these disparities as well, because this is also harming our communities, and this is also making it difficult for us to come together, because nobody is really as incensed about that as we are about seeing a Black man murdered in the street. It all matters.
We had a question. We had a question from Monica.
Before we move to the question, if you wouldn't mind if I chimed in super quickly.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
I think one of the barriers that we see in the South Asian community, we're talking about dimension across multiple oppression across multiple dimensions, like economic insecurity, food insecurity, housing insecurity. I think something, and I can speak to my parents and maybe the generation immediately before me that I've been trying to communicate with, but they think that because they came to the United States and they were able to build a life for themselves, these are things that are deterministic and people can take control of them. You can choose to escape the cycle of poverty if you put more work into it. So kind of challenging these norms that maybe the generation, for me, it's been about challenging these norms that the generation before me holds, that it is your choice to escape out of poverty, or we have more of a deterministic sense in the economic choices we make and where we're able to live, and helping them understand that these like dimensions of oppression are interconnected, and systemic racism doesn't necessarily just mean Black people being killed on the street. It also means they're deprived of getting good mortgages, and they're affected by diseases like chronic diseases at greater rates in other communities as well. So yeah, it's about challenging those norms that kind of avoid talking about how cyclical systemic oppression is.
Yeah. And I am definitely not someone who tries to gloss over things and make it seem like everything's just going to be okay. But a good question coming in from Monica, because we still have to have hope, is what, if anything, gives you hope? And I'm going to go around starting with Mashmi, go around talking about.
I will say definitely the youth activists that we have now, that's in our community. I hope that every state, every major city in every state has these youth activists. If they can just get through to like 2 people, that's it. each person get through like 2 people. Just to open your mind and break those barriers, I think we'll be on the right track at that point. And, you know, with the world coming together and being so, I guess mixed, you know, there are so many races and religions and cultures mixing now. I really hope that that does mean something for the future, that, hey, we're all just a big melting pot, you know, not just the US, but the entire world is just a melting pot. And, you know, I'm going to go back to one quick example. When I was getting ready to get married, a family member actually came and asked me, why can't I just find that exact same person, but white? And that like hurt me to the core, because that was crazy. It was just that whole like white supremacy, you know, like we have to idolize them. So we've got to get past that somehow. And like in my part, all I can really do is, of course, I've already worked on my family, my parents and everything, and just raise our son to be completely open-minded and never, you know, you're the best of both worlds. What we always tell him, you are the absolute best of both worlds. So never look down on anybody, you know, and just keep your mind open.
Rupkata, and then I will let Karima have the last word.
Something maybe from like a more of like an activist or organizer perspective, I'm going to plug a mutual aid network that I've seen expand in Atlanta that I absolutely love. It's called Free 99 Fridge. And the first time I saw one of their fridges next to the Warnock office, actually, during one-offs, and there was I can't remember her name. I wish I could plug her explicitly, but there was a woman over the summer who decided that there weren't enough free food fridges for underserved communities in Atlanta. So she brought together a collective network of people to donate fridges and food, and now they have partnerships with restaurants, and it's expanded so much. And I think they've been around for 6 or 7 months at this point. And it's so inspiring that mutual aid networks are gaining the traction that they are. So we're learning, especially COVID and the pandemic has given us this perspective that people really do care about each other, and they're willing to come together and support their communities when it really comes down to it. So the expansion of mutual aid gives me so much hope, because it means that we're realizing that even though it's convenient to ignore oppression for a lot of us, we don't want to do that anymore. We want to support our communities when they need it the most. So that gives me a lot of hope.
Yeah, and I was just going to plug, since you mentioned it, because I love that whole initiative. Her name is Letitia Springer. So just wanted to go ahead and give her the plug. And it was one of the things we highlighted on our Daisy Blue Sips of Chai this week too. So great organization. Yeah. All right, Karima, what gives you hope?
You know, what's really sad is somebody asked me this question last week and I couldn't give an answer. And I feel like I'm performing an answer in the interest of not wanting people to feel bad. But I wasn't one of those who dropped a blue peach on my Facebook page after the election. I didn't even go so far as to say Georgia is purple. Okay. So that said, I am a little inspired by the political engagement that I'm seeing. And by that, I don't mean voting. I mean, people really getting out and talking about the issues and putting, public pressure campaigns and taking to the streets and demanding change. There were a lot of pieces of legislation that came out of what happened over the summer, the Black Summer, and there were also some practices that changed that had nothing to do with the ballot box. It was all about public pressure. It was all about the community rising up to demand change, and that was absolutely inspiring to me. And as I look at what's going on under our Gold Dome here in Georgia right now, I am hopeful that same energy carries us through to the finish line as the legislature is challenging a lot of these rights that we kind of held. Some of us, I think, took for granted, maybe. I'm I'm hopeful that that same energy carries us through, because we still have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, we definitely do. And I mentioning what's going on under the Gold Dome right now. I was down there yesterday, and someone asked me to speak on behalf of an organization, a South Asian organization that I'm part of. And I said no, because at that moment, like, you think about things like that. And I said, why? I said, because there are like two of us here that look like me. And when we talk about hope, that was one of those moments. And I hear that where you feel the defeat. And I said, where is all the work we did? Where are all those people that were in the street last summer? Where are you? You are not here. And I am not going to stand there and say, yes, we are with you, because you're not here. And so, to me, not saying something just was more honest than standing there as a representative of an organization saying, I'm like, no, we are not with you, because we are not. And I think that's really, really important. And I feel, as we're wrapping up here, I know we can probably talk for another hour. We're going to wrap up. And, I just want to say thank you to everyone who's been watching on our live channel. Like I said, this is the first of these discussions. I hope we're going to have a lot more of these. I'd like to see all of you ladies again. There's so much more to talk about, so much further we can dig deep into these conversations. But we just wanted, from all four of us and the Raksha team, just want to say thank you for all your great comments, all the love for this conversation. And we just, just really want to say thank you. Thanks to three of you for being here, for Raksha, for giving us the platform to talk about this. And that will be it for me. And so
I did see a question in the comments that came up a few times about self-care.
Okay, go for it. We don't actually have a time limit. So go.
Shuman was asking what we do for self-care. And I guess since I noticed it, I can start.
Go ahead.
I have a pretty elaborate self-care routine when I engage it. So I definitely try to connect with nature regularly, touching the trees, smelling the air, noticing the changes in the leaves, taking time to really slow down, meditate, pray, journal. But I also believe that self-care is also community care. So making sure that I'm supporting my family, helping out with family, and local community needs is also a part of my self-care routine. Yeah. So nothing super elaborate. I did say elaborate, but it is it's something that I do regularly and pretty consistently. Otherwise, I don't think that I would be able to do the work that I do.
Yeah.
I would say for self-care, and Shuman, by the way, is my cousin. It's a great question. I would say for self-care, I'm very similar to what you do as well. And we try to do our best to help the homeless in Atlanta. We live right inside the city. So, we'll go under the bridges and help them. Even if we can just get cases of bottled water, feminine products for the women, whatever we can do. To me, that is also the same as self-care, because it's not just like, oh, I did something great today, but no, you genuinely feel like you are making a change. You're doing something to help them because they're living in tents. It's called Tent City. I'm sure a lot of people in Atlanta know that name, but you drive by them and they don't want anything. They don't even ask for anything. They're not standing there asking. They have no signs held up or anything. They're just going about their business. And when we do show up and bring things to them, they are genuinely so surprised and so happy that, you literally walk away crying, because it's just like, a case of water is nothing to us, but everything in the world, to them. So that truly is self-care. I completely agree with that.
Yeah, I wish I had a better answer for this question because it's kind of hard as a student to establish like a self-care routine. I haven't done a very good job of that. But kind of going back to this idea that self-care is very much about community care, making sure I'm grounding myself in whatever work I'm doing and making sure that I'm staying true to my principles and supporting my community. And also, so I am a musician. I've been playing an instrument for a very, very long time. So self-care for me means connecting back to my music, my spirituality, making sure that I'm grounding all the work that I do in the moral and spiritual principles that I hold, and ensuring that whatever direction I'm taking is towards progress and community.
Yeah, and I'll chime in too. This is my self-care. I am so rejuvenated by conversation and connecting with engaging, wonderful people like you. I mean, and I think that's the thing that I've missed most in this weird times we've been living in. But hopefully there's an end and we get to see each other. But I am really just one of those people that gets my rejuvenation and my energy from other good people. And so Tanisha will be looking for some of those baked goods that she makes. We know where to find those. And yeah, so Ritu, this is on YouTube. It's on the channels, and so you can share it. Please share it. And we'll be having more of these conversations. If you would like to be a part of one of these conversations, reach out. And we look forward to having more of these conversations and making some change in our communities because we're all in this together.
Yeah,
Thank you, everyone. Have a good
Thank
evening.
you. Thank
Bye.
you.